You talk about a couple where infidelity happened, and perhaps among the worst things that someone who's married might imagine that would be the storm you would face. And this couple made it. It wasn't easy, it wasn't quick. But I think it just might, be appropriate to pause on that particular battle for a minute and what can help turn the corner? What do they need to start doing? Can your marriage survive a storm? I'm Dr. Carol. Thank you for joining me in this episode. Marriage doesn't exist in isolation. Stuff happens in life and it impacts your marriage, whether that is financial trouble or illness, birthing a child, maybe a child with special needs. And then there can be things that happen in the marriage itself, God forbid, infidelity. All these things impact the relationship. Can your marriage survive such a storm? Many marriages who have made it through the storms say yes. And my guest on the program today is going to share with us some of those stories. Gary Thomas, he's been on our program before, and when Gary Thomas shows up, you respond great. Gary Thomas is one of our favorite guests that you respond to, and I am so happy that he's joining me again today. Gary is an author, a speaker, a pastor currently living in Colorado Springs. He's written a number of books, maybe like Cherish. Marriage is one of the top topics that he talks about. His book that is releasing right now is Making Your Marriage a Fortress, Strengthening Your Marriage to Withstand Life's Storms. I am so inspired by hearing the stories of the couples that Gary talked to in preparing this, and the inspiration that comes from seeing how they made it through the storms. I know this will be encouraging for you. So without waiting any longer, Gary Thomas. Well, Gary Thomas, I consider you a friend. Thank you for being back on our program once again.
Oh, thank you, Dr. Carol. It's an honor. I so appreciate what you do.
Well, those who know you know that marriage is a big part of what's on your heart and what God has given you to share about. And in thinking about that, your book that's releasing, marriages go through stuff. Life happens, whether it's financial trouble or an economic collapse or illness, God forbid, an affair. I mean, there's just stuff that happens. I am in Texas. You lived here in the past, and you opened the book talking about a Texas storm, and I've had a Texas thunderstorm here today. When storms come in marriage, just set us up with that.
Well, you know this, Houston is the hurricane city. People know it. Galveston even more than Houston. And we'd probably been in Houston 6 or 7 years. And we always heard the warnings. Every fall, you'd start to see the signs on the, late summer on the highway. Hurricane season is here. Get prepared. And we took it pretty seriously for the first couple of years. And then there'd be some projected storms and it really wouldn't be an issue. So after 6 or 7 years, you start to think,
Yeah.
And so when Harvey was coming, we were away, and somebody said, you really need to get back. And this isn't an alarmist kind of person. So I thought, well, maybe. And at first it hit, and it wasn't that bad. I mean, devastating for the coast, but not so much for Houston. But then Harvey moved, camped out over Houston, and dropped 55 inches of water in 3 days. It felt like Noah's Ark times. I mean, it wouldn't stop. And the water kept going up and up and up. Now I'm starting to think, well, this is serious, as it started to cover the wheels of my car. So I'm going in the garage trying to find something to waterproof my house. This is so embarrassing, Carol. All I could find was some cardboard and some blue painter's tape, which does nothing. And my wife is kind of laughing at me in spite of the situation, because of course it was worthless. Now, by God's mercy, it never got into our house. It was creeping up the yard. But it reminded me, just because you hear of other storms that don't affect you, that doesn't mean you're not going to be hit.
Yeah.
And just because warnings haven't come true That doesn't mean you shouldn't be prepared. After that year, we were prepared. And so I say to couples, this world is not kind to marriages. It's not. We get sick. Others
Yes.
get sick. We get depressed, financial situations, children's situations, you name it. All of these things can happen. And we think, well, it'll happen to them. It'll happen to them. And so we don't really prepare until it's too late. And if you're in the middle of a storm, which is cardboard and blue painter's tape, you'll say, yeah, I should have taken this a little more seriously.
Yeah.
So I went to these couples. I was looking for wise couples who had gone through some of the worst challenges, the worst curveballs life can throw at you. What did you learn? What did you do wrong? What did you do right? How have you come out closer together rather than further apart? And where I was so encouraged was while they said they did many things they wish they would have done differently, and they freely share that, it was further evidence that because we serve such a great and mighty God who is real, who is true, they came out feeling closer. They came out stronger. Some of them even saying, I never would have chosen to go through this, but because we went through it, I'm a stronger person and we have a more intimate marriage.
That is such a different paradigm than I think many people come to challenges that impact marriage with. And I'm not going to be able to point to the specific study, but I recall hearing research that looks at couples who have faced tough stuff, and they actually, if they persist, can have a greater sense of bonding afterwards than they did before. I noticed as I read through the chapters, the different stories, the different couples who had faced very different kinds of challenges, that theme of pursuing connection, you keep coming back to that over and over again. And I would guess that's because the couples kept talking about that. What does it require to pursue connection when the waves are coming in against you?
Well, it's recognizing that that's what needs to happen most. For instance, I mean, and it doesn't have to be bad things, Carol. It can be blessings. We talked to a couple where when you have a new baby come into the house, I love Dr. Les Parrott's phrase that when a new baby is born, a new marriage is born.
Wow.
And that's true for baby number 2, and that's true for baby number 3, 4, or beyond. And the key is for husband and wife to say, how do we make sure that adding a baby won't draw us apart from each other, but closer to each other? Financial storms. What we really found with the couples we talked to was the biggest challenge was one knew what was going on and one didn't.
Wow.
And to address it, they had to get on the same page. Okay, here are our goals. We're doing this together. And so when it drew them closer together, instead of blaming and being resentful and those kind of things, it actually drew them closer together. A couple that the guy, wonderful couple, he serves our country in the military, long deployments, and he goes to some scary places. How can the fact that we live thousands of miles apart in 5 different time zones, how do we still stay connected? A couple that had had an affair, the wife had cheated on him, and they say it was because we were disconnected. That set us up for the affair. How do we get reconnected in the face of betrayal and the trauma of your spouse being unfaithful? A couple with a severe medical issue where the husband got MS. All of these issues, it kept coming back to the same thing. How do we maintain emotional connection? And the reason this is so important is this: if whatever the event is that's pulling you apart succeeds in pulling you apart, now your marriage becomes the biggest issue.
Yes.
So when you face these trials, either your marriage will be a refuge where I wish this hadn't happened to me, but if I got to go through it, I'm so glad I get to go through it with you, hand in hand, arm in arm, heart to heart. Or now it's pulled us apart and I have to face this alone, and I have the heartbreak of a marriage that failed or that severely disappointed. And then the marriage becomes the biggest problem instead of the solution. And so it really does come back to emotional connection. In most of my books, you know, Dr. Carol, I speak of the spiritual connection. I still believe that's fundamental, but it was a research, and I, use people educated like you, Dr. Archibald Hart and Dr. Sharon May, a father-daughter team, people that better educated than I am that really stress the need for emotional connection as well. And I don't think I've stressed that enough in my previous books.
Wow. And you make the case in this book in talking about these various couples that emotional connection and spiritual connection, you really can't have one without the other. But to be fully spiritually connected to each other, emotional connection is there, and you can't ignore that. And another thing that stood out to me, you talk about in the spiritual part of life that couples have to be spiritually connected, but the prescription they need, the spiritual prescription they need, may be different as they go through this challenge together. That God works with us, he's working with both of us, but it might not look identical.
Yeah, absolutely. Because so often, well, let me just use a couple that faced MS. And let me set it up so your listeners can really understand.
Yeah.
Stacy grew up in a dysfunctional home, and she was looking for a guy that would make her feel safe, that would take care of, that would protect. Completely understandable, reasonable. It's not a wrong motivation to get married. So she marries a bodybuilder. People can't see me, but I mean, Daryl could bench press 400 pounds, which is about 350 pounds more than I could probably bench press right now. I mean, he's a really big guy, and then he's diagnosed with MS just a few years into their marriage. Wow. And has been in a chair now for a number of years in their marriage. And I'm sorry, I started to tell their story, and I forgot the question I'm supposed to answer. I'm so sorry.
No. That's okay. The spiritual prescription may be different.
Oh, yes. Okay. Yeah.
Between husband and wife.
Thank you. And so this was a classic example of Daryl is a half glass full person, and Stacy is a half glass empty person. Stacy's thinking, oh, this is terrible. This is going to be awful. We've got our whole lives. And Daryl is, well, it'll work out. God will come through. Something will happen. Here's the thing, Dr. Carol. They were both right and they were both wrong.
Yeah.
And the key is usually the half glass full person, that tends to be me and in my relationship, thinks we have the godly idea. And the half glass empty person thinks, well, I'm the only one living in reality. So instead of learning from each other and building each other up, you start to accuse each other. But here's the thing. Daryl's half glass full thing actually hurt him. He was an athlete. He said, I can beat this. I can work through it. And he doubled down on his workouts until the doctors told him, Daryl, you're making things worse. You don't understand. When you tear your body down, it's not recovering. Yeah. And so Daryl had to realize Stacy had a point. He couldn't pretend, as he put it, this elephant in the room called MS didn't exist. He couldn't wish it away. Yeah. But Stacy also had to learn that Daryl was right. She was looking at MS without the lens of God will be there. God is a refuge. God is a help in every need. And so there came a time when she realized, and this is what blew me away. So many of these stories, I was just so humbled. She said, Gary, I came to the conclusion that my fears about MS did more damage to our marriage than MS did.
Wow.
And she talked about the time she's at a dinner party. And it's hard for her because she's got to leave at about 8 o'clock because Daryl doesn't do well if he's not in bed early. But they were having a good meal with wonderful friends, and they were laughing. And she looked and she saw Daryl there in his chair laughing. And it was a fun evening. It was a great evening. And she said, Stacy, see what your fear did? You're okay. Yeah. You and your husband have a great marriage. You still have your friends. Yeah, Daryl's in a chair, but we still have good times. And so they both needed different prescriptions at different times. Stacy really had to focus on grieving. Yes. At first, she felt, you would know this, Dr. Carol, she felt guilty about grieving, that somehow that was dishonoring to God, but she realized, no, for a healthy response, I have to learn how to grieve. Mm-hmm. But Daryl also had to learn how to be realistic, that things had changed and he couldn't pretend they hadn't.
Yeah. You talk about a couple where infidelity happened, and perhaps among the worst things that someone who's married might imagine, that that would be the storm you would face. And this couple made it. It wasn't easy, it wasn't quick. But I think it just might, be appropriate to pause on that particular battle for a minute, and
Yeah.
what can help turn the corner? What do they need to
Yeah.
start doing?
What I know you have male and female listeners, but I also know, Dr. Carol, you have a lot of very educated, smart female listeners. So I want to share this because
Yes.
Terry is the woman who had the affair. And I think it's very pertinent to your audience because they're the kind of women that could be led astray like this.
Yeah.
What Terry did is that she lived with this aching black hole of emotional disconnection with her husband.
Mhm.
They got married for all the wrong reasons. Most couples will tell me about how they fell in love. Terry was up front. Oh, we fell in lust. It had nothing to do
yeah.
with love. So they got
Yeah.
married right away, had kids right away. But when you have babies and a toddler, lust dies pretty quickly.
Mhm.
It's the oxygen is gone. And so with a growing family, David, her husband, thought, well, we've got to earn more money. And he was a very successful salesman in Texas. And he would leave Sunday evening, come back Friday afternoon, and their marriage couldn't survive that.
Yeah.
And Terry just lived with it. We're just not with each other. We're just not connected. They lived lives that were alone. And you can do that for a while. Strong women can be lonely, sometimes for a long time, and it seems okay. It's not okay, but it's not disastrous.
Yeah.
But here's what happened. Living with this unfulfilled, desires
Yeah.
and disconnect from her husband, she saw there's a guy at work that started paying her a lot of attention. And she stresses, and again, I want to stress this. There wasn't an overwhelming lustful attraction. Oh,
Right.
I just got to have him. I don't mean to be untoward, but there wasn't this immediate, oh, yes, we got it. And there wasn't a romantic infatuation. She never felt like, oh, I'm in love again. It was just, she was so lonely. And here was a guy paying her attention and giving her compliments. And she missed that. So she found herself going out of her way to accidentally run into him at work and see him. And so that led to her being willing to accept his flirtations instead of saying, hey, I'm not up about that, which led to her accepting his invitation to go have drinks at a bar, which led later at one of those evenings for her to allow him to kiss her, which eventually led to an episode in a hotel. And so often affairs are gradual.
Mhm.
It's not this overwhelming desire emotionally or physically. It's not that she even knew at the time how disconnected her marriage was. She just wasn't taking care of herself, wasn't taking care of her marriage. And she had existed that way for a long time, like Lisa and I living in Houston without preparation for the hurricane. So when it hit, boom, it felt sudden and it took her by surprise.
Yeah.
And so we have to be aware that if we allow emotional disconnection in our marriage, we are making ourselves very vulnerable for that.
Mhm.
Now, their way back, it was entirely a spiritual renewal in their lives. They found forgiveness. Terry had to forgive herself. It took David longer to forgive Terry. There's a harrowing story in there of a bus crash with a bunch of people that almost killed her. It's a miracle she didn't die, and how through that God finally woke up David to saying, you must forgive her as you've been forgiven, and they put their lives back together. Here's the thing I want some of the listeners to hear. When I interviewed this couple, it was just after COVID had hit and completely stopped what they did. They travel on the road doing seminars. So now they've got a year of not being able to do that at all. And yet Terry sounded like a schoolgirl with a crush. This has been the best year of our marriage by far.
Wow.
So an affair doesn't have to end a marriage. I'm not guilting those who felt like that was the appropriate decision. Maybe a spouse was unrepentant or whatnot. I'm just saying there is hope if people want to pursue it. I've talked to couples that have faced down the most heartbreaking challenges, and they've not only survived, they've literally thrived. And they say they have never been closer as a couple.
That is, wow, that is so encouraging. And again, the connection piece.
Yes.
And as you described, Terry's heart, I believe God created us with a need for intimacy.
Yes.
Sex and intimacy related, not the same, but you're talking about there is a true need, regardless of your relationship status, for that kind of connection. And you will eventually starve if it's not there for a couple who, maybe they haven't quite reached, that point yet, but maybe they're just going along and, oh, okay. But, there's storm clouds out there and all they've got right now is cardboard and painter's tape. What should they be focusing on to get that connection back? Maybe they've let it lapse and it had their house hasn't fallen yet, but yeah.
Well, first, and this might sound counterintuitive, but the first way you start to build emotional connection is trust.
Good.
You can't really have intimacy without trust. And by trust, I'm not just saying don't be unfaithful or don't look at pornography. Of course, you shouldn't do that. What I mean is, if you say you're going to pick up the kids, if you say you're going to make a deposit, if you say you're going to pay the bill, do what you said you would do.
That's good.
Those little things have a big impact on a marriage where your spouse knows, I can trust you. You're going to come through. Our hearts can't open up if we're suspicious of someone or if you have to interrogate someone. And then it tempts people to lie. And I'm one of those that believe lying is to a relationship what murder is to a body. It's a spiritual divorce. You're saying, I'm not going to be with you. So trust is so key on so many levels. The second thing is sensitive responsiveness. When a spouse is sharing something, emotional connection is what matters most is that the connection is being fostered here. Yeah. And so guys, this isn't the time to try to fix it. I know our brains are wired. I've even written about this. I believe the neuroscience. Everything in our brain says, if I love you, I will try to fix this.
Yep.
Do that tomorrow. Today,
that's
for
good.
Emotional connection, she wants empathy. She wants you to hear. She wants you to understand and respond. Instead of trying to fix it, saying, man, that must have been awful. That must have hurt. And then she's going to feel good. Well, of course you responded that way. You were blindsided, or that's just such a betrayal. It makes sense to me. Just that, yes, finally, he gets me.
Yeah.
And then third is emotional availability. This is key. Is my spouse there for me emotionally? Mm-hmm. If the husband says, I feel like I've got this going on. Maybe I've got a spot on my skin or something. Am I getting skin cancer? Yeah, I've been thinking I need to go and do that. He's like, did you not just hear me? I'm concerned I have this medical issue, and all of a sudden you're turning it around. Are you emotionally available to care? Yeah. And so it's not often what your spouse is saying, it's who is saying it. If it's your spouse and you want them to feel emotionally connected, you have to be emotionally available. For me, Dr. Carol, that means making space. I can't get too tired. It means I have to pause and slow down and say, this is necessary, to be there, to make emotional space. And that might mean cutting out other things, not caring about other things so that I can care about what really matters. So trust, sensitive responsiveness, and emotional availability are three key predictors. And that's not me, by the way, that's Dr. Hart and Dr. May, the father-daughter team that writes about this.
That's really good. That's really good. And you alluded to, and I'll just expand on this for a second, this takes doing something out of the norm. This doesn't, for most people, just naturally flow. It takes saying no to other things so you can say yes to these best things. It requires you giving something to do this.
Yeah. 3 different couples came back to check-ins, what they call check-ins, where they realize if we're not intentional about this, it won't happen. And so one couple that just had new kids found Sunday night check-ins. That's where they're getting into it. how have you felt loved? How have you felt cherished? When did you not feel loved? When did you not feel cherished? What's your greatest temptation right now? How are you doing with the Lord? Just checking in with each other. Another couple had 3 different kinds of check-ins. They found they had to separate them because then it would start to overtake each other. They had the business check-ins once a week. What do we need to do for the house? What bills need to pay? What's going on with the kids? Then they had the weekly check-ins that were all about fun. And if they didn't do the business check-ins, the fun would be buried by the business. And the third check-in was a daily check-in in the morning. They just found, and this is a 5 or 10 minute thing. And then the husband had to learn check-ins don't work pre-coffee. And so he would get his wife's coffee, give it to her, give her 15 minutes, and then come in and say, okay, what do we have going on today? And for them, it just, and he loved it. The husband said this, he loved it because the wife, if they broke this and she felt disconnected, she couldn't respond physically, and he didn't want her to. Because he realized, I want us to be connected. And if this is a signpost that we're not, I don't want her to try to fake it physically. I want us to fix what makes her feel disconnected. So she wants to be with me physically. And then there was a third couple where the husband is in the military, a wonderful couple, where they had to figure out, how do we check in when we live thousands of miles apart and in different time zones? How do we still stay sexually connected? How do I make sure I have time? And I love one of the things he did where he was on deployment one time and there's some other chaplains with him. And so they went out 3 nights in a row. So he wasn't able to check in with his wife. And she really felt hurt. And then he realized, wait a minute, if I was at home, I would never go out for 3 evenings in a row and not check with my wife. And he goes, just because we're not living in the same town doesn't mean I'm not married. And he had to, no, we need these check-ins. I don't get to put my marriage on my shelf. I don't want to put my marriage on my shelf. We've got to stay emotionally connected, even when we're miles or time zones apart.
Powerful, powerful. And you brought sexual intimacy into that for a minute, Gary. And I love what you said about the couple, that if she didn't feel connected, he didn't want her. What I've come to understand about men is you want your wife to want you.
Yes.
Most men do, more than just the physicalness. And a wife needs to feel connected in order to do that. Of course, people are wired a little different, but that important component. Where does sexual intimacy fit into all this? It certainly can't fix a bad marriage. What role does it play in this?
Well, I think it's very practical role neurochemically with our brains. It's a practical role relationally. I think it's a practical role spiritually. I would affirm what you said just a little bit ago, that for most, I would say, healthy men, the most sexually exciting thing is a sexually excited wife. They don't want obligation sex.
Right.
They want a wife who is eager. Dr. Esther Perel said you can have work or play, but not both at the same time. and it's a good model to remember then how to do that. And so what I found, though, is that one of the couples, this is where the wife had the affair. The husband admitted to me, Gary, we had pretty good sex while she was having an affair. But this is a key. But it was a different kind of sex. It was what he called athletic sex. It wasn't sensual sex.
Wow.
It wasn't the kissing, the looking into each other's eyes. It was, I don't mean to be untoward, but using each other to get off was the language he used. I don't mean to be offensive there, but it was basically just each other trying to get a release, and that's what they wanted, and so they were okay. But they realized how far apart they were. So after her affair was exposed, well, she confessed it. He went through a process of being so angry and so frustrated. And so he started grilling her. This is weeks later.
Yeah.
He was like a detective trying to catch her in another lie because trust had been broken, right? He was hurting. Well, you said you went here then, but last time you said that. And so finally, Terry looked at David. They were in bed and she just said, David, you've asked me this question 100 times. But I'll answer it 100 times more. I want to do whatever I can. I'm so sorry. that I put you in this situation. So you see what happened. She's responding with trust.
Yeah.
I understand that I broke the trust, sensitive responsiveness. She could have said, it's really annoying that you still don't believe me or you're still trying to catch me, but there's sensitive responsiveness. You know what? It makes sense. I betrayed you. And then emotional availability. Okay, I'm here. You want to ask me that question 100 times? Every time I'll try to. And then David said, I don't need to hear anything else. And he said, Gary, we had the most fantastic sex of our lives because there was emotional availability before there was sexual expression. And he said it was a different kind of sex. So I would say to couples, it's not a bad barometer. Have we gone too long without having sex? Whatever too long can be, it's different for every couple. But I would also ask, what kind of sex are you having? Now, marriage has different kinds of sex. It's great to have fun sex, and it's okay at times if you want athletic sex or it's focused on play. But I think predominantly it should be that sensual, connecting, celebrating each other, expressing the desirability, wanting to serve each other, wanting to look at each other, that you're there not for an act, but for each other. And of course, when you do that, for the male brain flooded with oxytocin, the woman is too, but it's not the same because men tend to have lower levels of existing oxytocin at any given time. And so it does wonderful things for the relationship and helps them to connect. But I think it's looking at them together because for some couples, it's not just about increasing sex. It might be, okay, I'm not sensitive. I'm not responding in a sensitive way. I'm not emotionally available. Look there first. Or we're not praying together. Our spiritual lives are so, then you look at spiritual connection, or it could be intellectual. If your spouse is interested in Wordle, look, learn to play Wordle, or at least appreciate her scores. Let her show you those graphs and act like you care. Maybe you want to listen about the nonfiction book that he's just read. So find those different ways to build connection intellectually, emotionally, spiritually. And sex will be a great part of that and will benefit from that. But sex cannot carry the whole relationship. It's a wonderful addition, but it can't be everything.
That's good. That's good. And especially what kind of sex are you having? That's what I'm going to remember, Gary. That's a powerful one. Sometimes couples will face multiple waves, multiple attacks all at once. It may not just be one thing. Maybe, your spouse gets sick and then you lose your job, or, just when you're about to have a baby, who knows what. What about when it's just one after the other?
Yeah. That's the hard fact of life. A couple where one is in a wheelchair. I'm not talking about Daryl and Stacy here, but I know another couple where he's in a wheelchair, a child gets really sick, and he's brave and trying to deal with it. And then because he's in a wheelchair, he gets a form of cancer that often happens with people who have lived much of their lives in a wheelchair. And as their friends, you say, God, really? Yeah. Do they have to go through a third thing? Can they not catch a break? Yeah. And this is a whole different situation, but the couple that had financial deprivation for 2 decades now, I tell 2 stories. One where a couple recognized their debt and put into principles, from Financial Peace University with Dave Ramsey. And 3.5, 4 years later, it was fantastic. They were out of debt, even though when they were in debt, they owed more than he made in a year. But this other couple had given their way into debt. They just hadn't saved, and they gave beyond generously. They supported missionaries entirely. They sent some missionaries' kids to college. Then some economic factors happened where they even lost their house and they had nothing. And they keep praying. And Dr. Carol, they're still facing it. And so for them, I think we go back to the New Testament message of perseverance. James says, perseverance must finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything. Wow. Sometimes God cares about our character more than our affluence. Sometimes God cares about our maturity more than he cares about whether we feel good about him at any given moment. And I believe this couple has such a strong call of God on their lives She's phenomenal, PhD in education. He's a phenomenal therapist and just spiritual counselor as well as a relational counselor. I just think God has some real places that they can't get into, not just without their heart being broken, but their heart remaining broken for a long time. If you look in the New Testament, the theme of perseverance is woven through all the major writers. Jesus talks about it in Luke 8:15 when he says, and by persevering, they will produce a crop. Yeah. Jesus says it's not just immediately with joy, but it's as we persevere, we produce a crop. Paul says that we have to persevere in many of his different letters, and persevering assumes you want something to stop. I don't have to persevere when I'm eating a bowl of ice cream, right?
Right.
I'm trying to slow it down and make it last. I persevere when I don't like what's happening, and I learn to still be surrendered to God while it is. And so that there are some lessons we can't learn any other way. And I know maybe it doesn't even seem faith-filled for a pastor to talk like this, but when you've walked with people who have faced cancer or the grief of a lost child or the pain of betrayal, there are some seasons that just need to be endured. It's true to life. Grieve, you can't fix it. You can grieve, you can lament, you can receive comfort. But look, if you're going through cancer treatments, there's a lot of endurance. There's a lot of perseverance there. And be kind to yourself. God knows what you're going through. He's not just testing you as if he's malicious or this coach who doesn't care. His heart is breaking more than yours is. So don't shut him out. What I found with every couple, and this is the hope, when they needed God, he was there. He is a refuge. He is an ever-present help in times of need. And they didn't realize how much that was true until they needed him as desperately as they ever have.
Wow. That is great encouragement, again, regardless of your relationship status, but perhaps especially when you're going through hard times in marriages. God can be trusted. He is good, even if your circumstances aren't. Yeah. Gary, tell people about your book, Making Your Marriage a Fortress. We've alluded, we've been talking about it, but just,
I've written so many of mine: Sacred Marriage, A Lifelong Love, Cherish, Married Sex that we've talked about. And I've said kind of a lot of what I could say. And so this time I was almost more of a journalist. I mean, I'd had my little bit of scriptural thoughts here and there, but I just went to very wise, godly couples who had gone through these terrible times. And I said, tell me what you learned, what you did wrong, what you wish you would have done differently, what you're glad you did, and how others could learn from that. And so I'm just like this reporter, and I was just blown away. It was such a fun book to write, to be invited to these couples' lives. I think every married couple that's thoughtful and loves the Lord has at least a chapter in them where they could say, this is really what we learned. And I wouldn't want to face what any of these couples have faced, but just about everyone said we're stronger because we did face it. You've got that whole thing about God works for good for those who love him, for those who are called according to his purpose. Now, we don't want to quote that verse if somebody's in the midst of difficulties. It can be really painful. But when these couples are looking back, and saying it is true that God works all things for good for those who love him, you just realize how true Scripture is, how mighty and compassionate God is, and the wonder of marriage. The whole key of this book is this: you will face trials. But if your marriage crumbles in the face of the trials, that becomes your biggest trial. That becomes your biggest hurt. So how do you build the kind of marriage where it's a fortress against the trials rather than your biggest problem? I just want people's marriage to be a refuge, a place where they find great comfort in sometimes a very cruel world and experience a level of intimacy that they never would have known if they hadn't faced this hand in hand and heart to heart.
I was so inspired as I read the stories, the different chapters. You know, each main chapter, there's one primary couple that you unpack, and I found it so inspiring and so encouraging. Gary, we'll make sure that the links where people can find the book are in the show notes or under this video if you're watching, as well as to, you know, your website. I have been so enriched by you and by your work, and I found this book just one of the best. Thank you so much.
I'm excited for it to get out there. I was so inspired, and I could say that because I drew it from other couples, and so I'm eager for other people to meet these couples.
Yeah.
Some of the lines they gave me, I will never forget, and I believe that will be true for others as well.
Oh, I certainly agree. From having read it, it's true for me. Thank you, Gary. Bless you. It's been great to talk with you.
Thank you so much.
Well, if this conversation didn't inspire you, you need the book. It will inspire you. Get it. Making Your Marriage a Fortress, Strengthening Your Marriage to Withstand Life's Storms. I was so inspired by reading these stories, and then even more by this conversation with Gary. You'll find the link underneath this video, so do check that out. You'll also find the links under this video to connect with Gary Thomas at his website, his social media. Just a rich wealth of wisdom, experience, and I know you'll be enriched for it. I also want to let you know about our new resource at Dr. Carroll Ministries to help you build and maintain a fully alive marriage. This is an online video course that gets deep under the surface. This isn't marriage enrichment. This course helps you solve problems. It uncovers the expectations or the mindsets that set up your marriage for trouble, and helps you actually implement the things that set you up for success. Just like Gary Thomas and I were talking about in this conversation today, the things that make for connection. How do you actually do that? This gets practical, and you need this. Your marriage needs this. This is something that, God willing, you and your spouse go through together. But even if your spouse doesn't seem like they're on board right now, get this course, fullyalivemarriage.com. It will help change you. It will help you be the invitation for your spouse to come closer. It'll help you understand your own mindset, the stuff that you brought to the marriage, and what do you do with that? It'll help you address specific skills you need, like communication, building trust, sex and intimacy, handling conflict. It will also explain to you the investments you need to make for ongoing marriage success. These things work. fullyalivemarriage.com. You need this. Get the course today. You'll find the link under this video. And then lastly, I want to make sure that you are subscribed to our channel so that each time we put something new up, you can get that. Just subscribe. Leave a comment under this video, or if you want to leave a confidential comment for me, come over to our website, drcarrollministries.com. Use the contact page there, and it comes directly to me. It's confidential. Thank you for being with me in this episode today. And until next time, go and live fully alive.